What does it mean when the wrong people go quiet? Not the bystanders, not the casual observers, not the people who don't usually speak anyway. I'm talking about the individuals and institutions that Candace Owens flagged, the ones who normally sprint to a camera, the ones who feed on visibility, the ones who treat public commentary like oxygen. The point wasn't that their silence is incriminating, it's that it is uncharacteristic. That's the keyword. In any major national crisis, there are voices you expect to hear because they depend on narrative leadership. When those voices suddenly retreat, you pay attention, not to build a theory, but to understand the environment that you are standing in. Silence in moments like these has informational weight. In scripture, silence is rarely neutral. It's strategic, contemplative, or revealing. So when you see a cluster of power brokers suddenly closing their mouths at the same time, you don't assume conspiracy. You assume pressure. You assume coordination. Or at a minimum, you assume discomfort. And discomfort tells you that the narrative surface is not as stable as the public facing messaging claims it is. Candace highlighted this dynamic with brutal clarity. Certain political strategists, the ones who live on Twitter all day long, went radio silent within hours. Certain institutional spokespeople didn't give their usual preliminary statement. Certain media figures who normally go wall to wall with breaking news offered a single perfunctory segment and then pivoted away as if the assassination were a minor court update instead of a national rupture. This is the kind of behavioral pattern that analysts across the board, from left to right, have documented in past crises. Kyle Kalinske has talked about how insiders often go quiet, not because they don't know what to say, but because they know too much and don't want to contradict a narrative still under construction. Temple has pointed out that silence from institutional actors is a signal of internal uncertainty. The moment before everyone decides which version of the story they feel safe endorsing. Even creators like Brandon Tatum have emphasized that silence from certain officials usually means information hasn't stabilized enough to risk public positioning. These aren't fringe theories. They're observations based on a decade plus of watching how institutions communicate. Historically, we've seen this exact phenomenon during major scandals. Think back to the initial hours after the 2012 Benghazi attack. Multiple officials who normally spoke freely clamped down until the talking points were finalized, or the early stages of the 2008 financial collapse, where high ranking banking executives avoided microphones until they knew how deeply their institutions were implicated. Even during the early pandemic briefings in 2020, silence from certain agency leaders became a tell, a sign that information at the top wasn't aligned enough for broad public comment. Silence isn't proof of wrongdoing every time, but it is proof of discomfort. It is proof that people with high stakes knowledge are choosing not to risk being on record too early. Open source investigators like those at Bellingcat often track these silence windows as part of their timeline reconstructions. They don't treat silence as evidence, but they treat it as a data point. And data points matter when patterns start stacking. As Christians, we understand patterns. Christ teaches parables built on repetition, cycles, and seasons. When the voices who normally shape public perception suddenly retreat, you don't panic. You simply note the shift. What makes this particular silence so striking, and Candace hammered this, is that it wasn't random. It clustered around nodes of influence: campaign operatives, national security commentators, certain media gatekeepers, and a few elected officials who typically cannot resist a camera, even on irrelevant days. Their sudden restraint told a story no press conference addressed. And here's where other voices sharpened the point. The breaking points team discussed how institutional silence often indicates internal tension. Someone upstairs hasn't decided what the main line will be yet. Ben Shapiro pointed out that when high visibility actors suddenly decline to comment, it often means facts behind the scenes are volatile, and no one wants to anchor themselves to a version that might collapse. Russell Brand, in his political commentary, frequently observed that silence from major power brokers usually signals narrative choreography rather than natural hesitation. And as believers, we identify this instinctively. Discernment doesn't just listen to statements, it listens to absences too. Proverbs leans into this truth. Wisdom often lies not in what is said, but in what is withheld. Silence from people who are normally loud is not emptiness, it's signal. It is a shift in the spiritual and political atmosphere. And that shift always deserves examination. So let's follow the thread a little further. Because what happened next is where the pattern sharpens. After that initial wave of silence from political operatives and institutional voices, attention shifted to the agencies and organizations that would normally brief the country. And here again, Candace Owens noted something unusual: the delay. Not a long delay, not days, just long enough to be noticeable to anyone who follows crisis communication. Major agencies usually sprint to shape the first frame because whoever sets the frame often controls the next 48 hours. But this time, some of those early updates were shorter, thinner, more hesitant than usual. Not quite inaccurate, just incomplete. And that incompleteness echoed across multiple institutions. Glenn Greenwald broke this down on his show, pointing out that institutions typically hesitate when internal assessments are not aligned. He wasn't calling it a cover up, he was calling it a bureaucratic stutter. Similarly, the Young Turks, despite their ideological opposition to Candace, highlighted how a lack of forceful early clarity often indicates an internal scramble. Even independent analysts like Matt Taibbi observed that when too many institutions appear muted at the same time, it usually signals a collective uncertainty. And as Christians, we get that silence and uncertainty often reveal the fault lines of human systems. When human authority feels shaky, that's when we lean into divine authority, which is clear, grounded, and unbothered by chaos. But here is where the silence becomes even more telling. It wasn't just the institutions, it was the insiders, the people who normally respond immediately because they have reputational or political incentives to get ahead of the story. You had commentators who usually live tweet breaking events, posting nothing for 5, 6, 7 hours. You had campaign staffers from multiple sides suddenly waiting for more information before making even the most generic statements. And then you had the national security adjacent voices who normally jump in with instant hot takes, suddenly choosing the safe route. Factual recaps with zero interpretation. Joe Rogan brought this up on his podcast, noting how people who usually jump in with bold analysis suddenly reverted to beginner level caution. Dave Rubin framed the same silence as a wait for permission moment. Not because anyone said they had to, but because the social and political states suddenly ballooned. And Ellie Beth Stuckey, approaching it from a Christian worldview, talked about how silence from influential voices often signals a deeper discomfort with the spiritual weight of an event, especially when it exposes institutional fragility. None of these people were saying the same thing, but collectively, their observations described the same atmosphere: hesitation. And hesitation from power is rarely meaningless. Now, historically, silence like this is practically a diagnostic tool. It shows up whenever insiders feel the ground shift under their feet. Think about Watergate. In the earliest days, before the scandal became a scandal, several administration officials who normally spoke freely suddenly became evasive. Not guilty per se, just overly and uncharacteristically cautious. Or look at the early hours after the Snowden leaks in 2013. Major intelligence heads avoided microphones until they understood what had leaked and what hadn't. This is not conspiracy, it is self preservation. Even during the January 6th Capitol attack, a number of typically vocal politicians went quiet for several hours because they didn't yet know how the event would be politically interpreted. Silence from the wrong people is often less about the event itself and more about the narrative that will eventually surround it. Institutions stall when they know a story could go multiple ways. They wait for the dominant interpretation to emerge. And here is where the pattern aligns with scripture. Jesus wanted his followers to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Wisdom means paying attention not just to words, but to omissions. Discernment means recognizing when silence is protective rather than reflective, and when the wrong people go quiet at the same time. That is your cue to wake up. And this leads to the heart of why today's theme matters in this big old scheme of things. Silence reveals pressure points. It shows you where institutions feel vulnerable. It shows you where narratives are not yet solid enough to stand on their own. And for believers, recognizing these moments is not about fear, it's about clarity. When Candace calls out the silence, she's really calling out the gap between power and transparency. Even when commentators across the spectrum, from Shapiro to Greenwald to Ali, note the same atmospheric quiet, it becomes a multi-witness pattern. Proverbs teaches that by the mouth of two or three witnesses, a matter is established. Not a verdict, but clarity. Patterns help you see where systems are bending under weight they don't want exposed. In kingdom language, this is where discernment kicks in. You learn to notice the tone, the pacing, the absences. You learn to read the room spiritually and culturally. And instead of panicking or assuming the worst, you realize something simple but powerful. When the wrong people go quiet, it usually means something beneath the surface is shifting. And if you belong to Christ, you navigate those shifts with authority, not anxiety. You are steady, grounded, alert, and unshaken.